Michael Faraday, 1791 to 1867. Part 1. Slide 1. Michael Faraday was an English scientist who made huge contributions to the fields of electromagnetism and electrochemistry. Although he received little formal education, he is one of the most influential scientists in history, ranking 23rd on Michael Hart's top 100 list, which we met in the previous lecture on Newton. Many science historians consider Faraday the best experimentalist in the history of science. His principal discoveries include those of electromagnetic induction and electrolysis. Electromagnetic induction may sound rather esoteric and fancy, but if I tell you it is the basic physical process for the operation of electric motors and dynamos for generating electricity, then you can perhaps appreciate the enormous contribution Michael Faraday has made in our everyday lives. His inventions of rotary electromagnetic devices formed the foundation of electric motor technology, and it was largely due to his efforts that electricity became practical for use in technology. Electrolysis is a method of using a direct electric current to drive an otherwise non-spontaneous chemical reaction. Electrolysis is highly important commercially as a stage in the separation of elements from naturally occurring sources, such as ores. Examples include aluminum, magnesium, and calcium. It is also the basis of electroplating. Not only did Faraday excel as a physicist, he was also a first-rate chemist. An announcement in 1818 that breathing ether vapor induced loss of awareness was published anonymously. However, Faraday's notes clearly establish him as the author of the brief communication. In 1825, he discovered benzene, and he also invented an early form of the Bunsen burner. In addition, he popularized terminology such as anode, cathode, electrode, electrolyte and ion. 1. Faraday was one of the unique band of scientists who could convey their ideas in clear and simple language. However, his mathematical abilities were limited and did not extend as far as trigonometry nor anything but the simplest algebra. James Clerk Maxwell took the work of Faraday and summarized it in a set of equations that is accepted as the basis of all modern theories of electromagnetic phenomena. Albert Einstein kept a picture of Faraday on his study wall, alongside pictures of Isaac Newton and James Clerk Maxwell. The Nobel laureate Ernest Rutherford said, of Faraday, "When we consider the magnitude and extent of his discoveries and their influence on the progress of science and of industry, there is no honor too great to pay to the memory of Faraday, one of the greatest scientific discoverers of all time." When asked by the British government to advise on the production of chemical weapons for use in the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, Faraday refused, citing ethical reasons. Slide 2. Today, the unit of capacitance, the farad, is named in his honor. It measures an electronic component's capacity for storing charge. Also, the Faraday is the agreed-upon standard of electrical charge involved in electrolysis. Faraday published a number of books, but almost all are collections of his scientific papers or transcriptions of lectures. Faraday's father, James Faraday, was a blacksmith who came originally from Yorkshire in the north of England. James was a member of the Sandemanian sect, a primitive but strict Christian group founded around 1730 in Scotland, which had split from the Church of Scotland. Sandemanians believed in the literal truth of the Bible and tried to recreate the sense of love and community, which had characterized the early Christian church. The religious influence was important for Michael Faraday since the theories he developed later in his life were strongly influenced by a belief in a unity of the world. His mother, Margaret Hastwell, also from the north of England, was the daughter of a farmer. Slide 3. Early in 1791 James and Margaret moved to Newington Butts, now the Elephant and Castle region of London, just south of the River Thames. In 1791 it was a village outside London, about 1 mile south of London Bridge. It was somewhere James hoped that work, possibly through contacts he had with the Sandemanians, would be available. James and Margaret already had 2 children, a boy Robert and a girl, before they moved to Newington Butts. Michael was born in the September after their move. James had fragile health and only worked intermittently. At times only the charity of others kept the family from outright starvation. Nevertheless, the Faradays were buoyed by their bedrock religious faith and their belief in the blessings of a simple, if impoverished life. In 1796, the Faraday family, now 6 in number, moved to cramped quarters over a coach house in Jacob's Wells Mews in central London. Later Michael Faraday was to recall that in those times, the loaf of bread his mother gave him had to last a week. Michael started at a day school where he learned to read, write, and count. However, his mother withdrew him when his schoolmistress attempted to beat a speech defect out of him. He could not pronounce his R's and referred to his brother as Wobert and was never happy when he had to give his full name. Now, aged 13, Faraday had to find work to help the family finances. Slide 4. He found a job as an errand boy for Georges Ribaut, a French émigré and political radical who had a book-selling business. Ribaut's shop was only a few hundred yards from Faraday's home. A year later, in 1805, Faraday was taken on by Ribaut as an apprentice bookbinder and he served a total of 7 years with Ribaut. 3. Slide 5. Incidentally, Ribaut's bookshop is now a sandwich bar, doorsteps, and a realtor's office, aptly called Faraday's. A plaque on the wall commemorates Faraday's apprenticeship here. Not only did Faraday bind books for Ribaut, but he also read them eagerly, including a 1809 edition of Isaac Watts' The Improvement of the Mind. Slide 6. The book was a common-sense self-help guide that served as a kind of mentor to the young Faraday, and he enthusiastically embraced and implemented the principles it contained. In 1813 Ribaut wrote a letter to a London magazine in which he described how Faraday spent his days as an apprentice. After the regular hours of business, Dr. Watts's Improvement of the Mind was then read and frequently took in his pocket, when he went an early walk in the morning, visiting some other works of art or searching for some mineral or vegetable curiosity. His mind ever engaged. Besides attending to bookbinding, which he executed in a proper manner. His mode of living temperate, seldom drinking any other than pure water, and when done his day's work, would set himself down in the workshop. If I had any curious book from my customers to bind, with plates, he would copy such as he thought singular or clever. Ribaut's shop proved a fertile environment for the inquisitive but virtually unschooled Faraday. A steady stream of books passed through his hands covering a wide range of subjects. But it was books on science that excited him the most. In 1810, he was binding an edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica when he chanced upon a 127-page entry on electricity, and that really piqued his interest. So much so, that he spent what little money he had on equipment so he could carry out his own experiments. Slide 7. He was also particularly fascinated by the 2-volume set of Conversations on Chemistry by Jane Marcet. Marcet was not herself a chemist, but she had conceived of a novel way to do this by inventing 3 characters, a teacher Mrs. Bryan, or Mrs. B as she is called in the text, and her 2 interested and excited pupils Emily and Caroline, reminiscent of Galileo's dialogues. The books are interesting as science was not a subject regularly taught to girls and certainly not one taught by women. Yet Conversations on Chemistry became one of the most important books in chemistry and ran to 16 editions in the UK and the USA. Faraday later wrote, "Whilst an apprentice, I loved to read the scientific books which were under my hands." London, at that time, was alive with lectures, demonstrations, and exhibitions on science and pseudoscience. On any given evening, citizens with little formal schooling could attend these ad hoc classrooms and hear about the developments in science. And so it was, on Monday evening, February 19, 1810, Faraday borrowed a shilling and marched through London to his first lecture on science carrying pencil and paper. It was held at the house of a certain John Tatum, the founder of the City Philosophical Society. Tatum was not a bona fide scientist, but he had carried out his own experiments and read extensively. Faraday attended these Monday lectures on many different topics, but he was particularly interested in those on electricity. He wrote careful notes and sketched the various pieces of demonstration equipment. He collated each set of lecture notes into chapters in what would become his sourcebook on the sciences. When it was done, he bound his lecture notes and dedicated them to George Rebow. He wrote, "To you is to be attributed the right and existence of that small portion of knowledge relating to the sciences which I possess." Several weeks after attending his first lecture at Tatum's house, Faraday himself stood at the lectern and delivered his first public lecture. In 1812, Rebow showed Faraday's book to one of his customers, who just happened to be a member of the Royal Institution. Slide 8. Impressed, the customer arranged for Faraday to attend a series of lectures by Humphrey Davy at the Royal Institution. Naturally, Faraday made careful copies of the lecture notes. Faraday had already tried to leave the bookbinding trade, and the route he tried was certainly an ambitious one. He had written to the president of the Royal Society, asking how he could become involved in scientific work. Perhaps, not surprisingly, he had received no reply. When his apprenticeship ended in October 1812, Faraday got a job as a bookbinder with Henry de Laroche, but he still attempted to get into science, and again he took a somewhat ambitious route for a young man with little formal education. He wrote to Humphrey Davy, who had been his hero since he attended his chemistry lectures. He sent Davy copies of the lecture notes, some 300 pages he had taken at his lectures at the Royal Institution. Davy was intrigued and replied to Faraday and arranged a meeting. They met early in 1813, but, unable to offer him a position as an assistant, Davy advised the young Faraday to keep working as a bookbinder, telling him, "Science is a harsh mistress, and in a pecuniary point of view but poorly rewarding those who devote themselves to her service." But, shortly after the interview, Davy's assistant was sacked for fighting. Davy sent for Faraday and invited him to fill the empty post. So it was, on March 1, 1813, Michael Faraday joined the Royal Institution as a chemical assistant, lodging in the attic, plus at Faraday's request a laboratory apron and permission to use the apparatus for his own experiments. In October 1813, Davy set out on a scientific tour of Europe, and he took Faraday with him as his assistant and secretary. Faraday met André-Marie Ampère and other scientists in Paris. They traveled through Italy, where they spent time in Genoa, Florence, Rome, and Naples. Heading north again, they visited Milan, where Faraday met Alessandro Volta, who, in 1800, had invented the first battery. The trip was sometimes uncomfortable for Faraday because Davy's wife refused to treat him as an equal, making him travel outside the coach and to eat with the servants, etc. Nevertheless, It proved important one for him, for what he learned in 18 months in Europe was vastly superior to what he would have learned in several years at university. He had added considerably to his scientific attainments and had met and talked with many of the leading foreign men of science. In addition, he gained a working knowledge of French and Italian. Slide 9. On his return to London, Faraday was re-engaged at the Royal Institution as an assistant involved mainly with chemical experiments in the laboratory. He also began lecturing on chemistry topics at the Philosophical Society. He published his first paper in 1816 on caustic lime from Tuscany. From that time on he wrote an increasing number of notes and memoirs. Slide 10. In 1821 Faraday married Sarah Barnard, whom he had met while attending the local Sandemanian church. It was an event, he wrote, which more than any other contributed to my earthly happiness and healthful state of mind. Slide 11. The same year he was appointed superintendent at the Royal Institution and given additional rooms to make his marriage possible. He and Sarah had no children. The year 1821 marked another important time in Faraday's researches. He had worked almost entirely on chemistry topics, yet one of his interests from his days as a bookbinder had been electricity. In 1820 several scientists in Paris made significant advances in establishing a relationship between electricity and magnetism. Davy became interested and this gave Faraday the opportunity to work on the topic. He published a paper on some new 7 electromagnetical motions and the theory of magnetism in October 1821, in which he recorded the first conversion of electrical into mechanical energy and rotational motion, and so he developed the first electric motor. I will show a demonstration in part 2 of this lecture. In the 10 years from 1821 to 1831 Faraday again undertook research on chemistry. His 2 most important pieces of work during that period were liquefying chlorine in 1823 and isolating benzene in 1825. Between these dates, in 1824, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. It was awkward for Faraday since Davy was president of the Royal Society and he could not see the man who he still thought of as his assistant becoming a fellow. Although Davy opposed his election, he was overruled by the other fellows. Faraday never held the incident against Davy, always holding him in the highest regard. In 1825, Faraday was appointed director of the Royal Institution. Slide 12. Remembering his early days, Faraday introduced a series of Christmas lectures on a single topic at the Royal Institution in 1825. The lectures present scientific subjects to a general audience, mainly children, in an informative and entertaining manner. They came at a time when organized education for young people was scarce and they established him as England's scientific ambassador to its citizens. Faraday gave a total of 19 Christmas lectures over his lifetime. The lectures have continued annually since 1825, interrupted only by World War II, and they have been televised since 1966. Many famous scientists including Nobel laureates have taken part. In 1831 Faraday returned to his work on electricity and made what is arguably his most important discovery, namely that of electromagnetic induction. This discovery was the opposite to that which he had made 10 years earlier. He showed that a magnet could induce an electrical current in a coil of wire. So, he was able to convert mechanical energy into electrical energy, discovering the first dynamo. I will show a demonstration in part 2 of this lecture. He published his first paper in what was to become a series on experimental researches on electricity in 1831. When asked by William Gladstone, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, i.e., the Minister of Finance, About the practical worth of electricity, Faraday answered. Why, sir, there is every probability that you will soon be able to tax it. In 1832 Faraday began receiving honors for his contributions to science. He was given an honorary degree as a Doctor of Civil Law from the University of Oxford. He received the Copley Medal twice, in 1832 and 1838, the highest award given by the Royal Society. In February 1833 he became Fullerian Professor of Chemistry at the Royal Institution, a lifetime appointment. Further honours followed, including the Royal Medal twice, in 1835 and 1846, and the Rumford Medal in 1846, also given by the Royal Society. The extremely high workload eventually told on his health, and in 1839 he suffered a nervous breakdown. He recovered, and in 1845 he began intense research activity again. In the mid-1850s Faraday's mental abilities began to decline. However, he continued to lecture at the Royal Institution. He was offered the presidency of the Royal Society in 1857, but he declined, and he also refused a knighthood. He told a friend, "I must remain plain Michael Faraday to the last." He did continue to give the children's Christmas lectures. In 1859, the topic of the lectures was the various forces of matter and their relations to each other, and in 1860, the topic was the chemical history of a candle. These two final series of lectures by Faraday were published in book form and today are considered true 9 classics. Faraday's laboratory, where many of his most important discoveries were made, was restored in 1972 to the form it had in 1854. A museum, adjacent to the laboratory, houses a unique collection of original apparatus arranged to illustrate the most important aspects of his immense contribution to the advancement of science in his 50 years at the Royal Institution, and is well worth a visit. Slide 13. Faraday died on August 25, 1867 at his house at Hampton Court, which had been given to him by Queen Victoria. He was almost 76 years old. He was interred in the Dissenters, i.e., non-Anglican, section of Highgate Cemetery. His wife died in 1879 and was buried in the same grave. Slide 14. He had previously turned down burial in Westminster Abbey, but he has a memorial plaque on the floor in the nave, near Isaac Newton's tomb. Beyond the motor, generator, and other electromagnetic advances, the list of Faraday's contributions to humanity runs long, touching areas as diverse as chemistry, geology, metallurgy, optics, and education. He sought no personal gain from his discoveries and routinely refused lucrative consultantships as immaterial to his committed purpose, and for nearly 40 years, he invited the public into the Royal Institution to share his enduring sense of wonder. 10.